Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Mark Bollinger, and I am a research scientist with the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Today, I will walk you through the contents of a new report that I and my LB&L colleagues Will Gorman and Dev Milstein, along with Dirk Jordan from NREL, have published, titled Plant Level Performance and Degradation of 31 Gigawatts of Utility Scale PV in the United States. This report is an update to a journal article that we published back in 2020. Compared to that original article, this new report expands the sample size of plants that we examine by about 50% and also adds 2 additional calendar years of performance in 2019 and 2020. Okay, here's a quick overview of what I'll cover. I'll introduce this topic by trying to convince you why this matters, and then I will take a few minutes to draw the distinction between plant level performance decline and module degradation. We're measuring the former, not the latter, and it's important to keep that in mind as you digest our findings. Then I'll briefly describe the plant sample before getting into our approach and findings for our assessment of both first-year performance as well as performance decline over time. Analyzing utility scale PV plant performance is important because utility scale plants, which we define here as any ground mounted plant that's larger than 5 megawatts, these plants make up the bulk of the overall solar market in the United States. Yet the utility scale sector is still relatively young. The first utility scale PV plants in the US came online as recently as 2007. So that's not a very long track record, particularly for a technology that is expected to operate for 30 years or longer. And the utility scale sector has been growing rapidly in recent years, such that the average utility scale PV plant in the US is only about 4 years old at this point. And this combination of a young market supplying the bulk of solar energy in the US makes understanding how these plants are performing important. This is particularly the case given the ongoing phase down of the federal investment tax credit, or ITC, which will elevate the importance of good performance in order to meet return targets going forward. And likewise, as both the price and duration of power purchase agreements, or PPAs, continue to decline, there is increasing focus on long-term performance and reliability during the post-PPA period. Now, much of the PV performance literature to date has focused on module level performance and degradation, and that's certainly understandable given that the module is the backbone of the system. But what truly impacts the bottom line for investors is total plant performance, and that's what our work here focuses on. And I want to draw that distinction a little more clearly on this next slide. The graph here shows an illustrative stylized buildup from module level degradation to plant level performance decline over time. So the dark blue shaded area at the top of the graph shows the contribution of module degradation, which in this example is running at about 0.5% per year. The vertical bars in the graph that drop down from the top show isolated hypothetical loss events related to different balance of plant components, while the correspondingly colored shaded areas track the cumulative loss over time resulting from these isolated events. So for example, failures of inverters or breakers or transformers might knock the entire plant offline for some period, while other things like misaligned or stuck trackers or curtailment might cut only part of the plant's output at certain times. But all of these events contribute to cumulative loss over time, which, as you can see over on the right-hand y-axis, is running at about 1.3% per year in this example, which is more than twice as much as module degradation alone. So keep this distinction in mind as we run through this. We're looking at plant level performance and performance decline, and not just module degradation. Okay, as I mentioned, our updated plant sample is 50% larger in terms of both the number of plants and plant capacity than it was in our original analysis. And we've also tacked on 2 additional years of performance in 2019 and 2020. Specifically, as shown in the table here, we look at 631 utility scale PV plants totaling 31 gigawatts of DC capacity installed across 37 states from 2007 through 2018. And that means that we've got anywhere from 2 to 13 years of operational history for each plant. In aggregate, the plants in our sample contributed more than half of all solar generation across all 3 sectors in the United States in 2019. So it's a big chunk of the overall market that we're looking at here. Not surprisingly, the sample tends to be dominated by California, though again, it does span 37 states. Here we see a bit more of a sample description, in this case, focusing on trends over time in the table at the top, as well as the distribution of plant size or capacity in the histogram at the bottom. Up in the table, you can see a growing sample over time, generally featuring higher DC to AC ratios and a greater use of single axis tracking. The histogram, meanwhile, shows that many plants fall into the 20 to 50 megawatt size range, but we do have some very large plants in our sample as well, in some cases upwards of several hundred megawatts. And for each plant in the sample, we collect key information required for the analysis. This includes project characteristics, which are often referred to as metadata. And we were fortunate here to be able to draw upon our extensive plant level database that we've compiled for our annual utility scale solar report series, which is a separate effort that is also funded by the DOE Solar Energy Technologies Office. We also collected annual net generation data for each plant, as well as historical irradiance data for each plant site from the National Solar Radiation Database. We did attempt to control for curtailment within California and Texas, and I'll talk a bit more about that on the next slide. And then finally, we used all of these data to calculate both actual and ideal capacity factors for each plant. So in other words, we normalize performance across all plants by calculating annual calendar year capacity factors according to the formula shown at the bottom of this slide. Before moving on, I just want to say a few words about curtailment, as it has become an increasingly important issue for solar. As I mentioned, we did attempt to control for curtailment within both CAISO and ERCOT, which are the only 2 ISOs to report solar curtailment data at present. Since all 7 ISOs report wind power curtailment, we assume that solar curtailment is not yet happening, or at least is not yet widespread in the other 5 ISOs that don't yet report it. Similarly, there are a number of solar plants in the Southwest and Southeast regions in particular that are not part of an ISO. And for lack of better data, we simply assume that these plants have not been curtailed either. Now, this obviously may or may not be a good assumption, particularly given that curtailment has been steadily increasing in California over time and has been high in ERCOT for the past few years, as you can see in the graph over on the right. But that said, we did run some sensitivity analyses to try and gauge the impact of how we treat curtailment. And without going into the details here, those results seemed pretty robust, which gave us some confidence in how we're handling this. So moving on, the first thing we did as part of our analysis was to look at first-year performance by comparing actual to modeled capacity factors. The scatter plot on the left shows this comparison color-coded by plant vintage, while the plot on the right shows the same comparison color-coded by region. In either plot, you can see that there is a pretty strong correlation of 92% between modeled and actual performance. But there does seem to be some first-year underperformance, with the best fit regression line falling below the unity line and also dropping off more steeply towards the lower end of the capacity factor range. Looking at the color coding, the underperforming outliers seem to be concentrated among newer plants, as well as those located in Texas, California, the Southeast, and the Northeast. And while our data are not really granular enough to tease out what's behind these apparent concentrations, I've listed 5 theories here at the bottom of the slide. So first, we may not adequately be controlling for curtailment, given that curtailment is a growing issue that is more likely to affect the first-year performance of newer plants than it is of older plants. As I mentioned, we do attempt to control for curtailment in both California and Texas, but we have no data on potential curtailment in some other regions like the Southeast, and that could be a factor here. Second, newer plants tend to have higher DC to AC ratios, which can increase sub-hourly clipping, which reportedly has been a challenge for hourly performance models to replicate. Likewise, newer plants may be more likely to be sited on uneven terrain, which performance models can also struggle with. And if you believe that the frequency and intensity of severe weather events has increased over time, then that might also be a contributor to these trends. Snow might also be a factor, particularly in the Northeast and Midwest regions. And finally, even though we're focusing on first-year performance to try and remove degradation as an influence, there could obviously still be some early first-year degradation at work here as well. So that's first-year performance. But how does performance hold up in later years? To answer that question, we used what's known as a fixed effects regression model. And here I thought I'd briefly define the terms of that model or equation. So the left-hand variable is the actual capacity factor. And for plants located in California and Texas, we gross up the actual capacity factor to correct for curtailment. The first variable on the right-hand side is called the ideal capacity factor, which is modeled based on the plant characteristics or metadata, as well as the solar resource. And the idea behind this ideal capacity factor is to control for as much of the geographic and temporal variability as we can by modeling how the project should have performed based on its metadata and solar resource. Then next in green, we have the site level fixed effects variable, S sub F, whose purpose is to control for any remaining difference across projects or sites that are not already captured by the ideal capacity factor. And in red, we have the age fixed effects variable, A sub T, whose purpose is to control for any remaining variation within each plant over time that again is not already captured by the ideal capacity factor. And this age fixed effects variable shown here in red is really what we're focusing on, as it will tell us how the average sample-wide performance has changed with project age. Now, this is called a fixed effects model because it holds constant or fixes the average effects of each variable in the equation. And we can illustrate how this works through two simple transformations of the original equation 1 up top that I just walked you through on the prior slide. So equation 2 simply takes the average of each variable in equation 1 over time. And because the site level fixed effects, S sub F, do not vary over time, the average of S sub F is simply equal to itself, or S sub F. And then equation 3 towards the bottom simply subtracts equation 2 from equation 1. As you can see, the site level fixed effects cancel out and drop out of the equation altogether, leaving only those explanatory variables that do vary over time. So in other words, by subtracting the means, we eliminate all unobservable variation across plants and leave only the variation within plants over time, which is what we're really interested in. And here we see the results of the model. The blue dots represent the age fixed effects for each age 1 through 13. The shaded blue area represents the 95% confidence interval around those age fixed effects. And you can see that it widens quite a bit as sample size declines for ages 10 through 13. And then the dashed line is a best fit regression line that is weighted by the number of plants at each age. And this means that the older plants with the wider confidence intervals don't have as much influence on the slope of that best fit line, which as you can see is minus 1.2% per year. And again, that's our estimate of average performance decline with age across the full sample of projects, namely minus 1.2% per year. This next slide compares our updated results to our original results from when we last looked at this back in 2020. So in blue, you see the very same data and graphic as you just saw on the prior slide with a slope of minus 1.2%. And in orange, you see the results from our original analysis back in 2020, where the slope was a little worse at minus 1.3%. This slight improvement that we've seen from 1.3% to 1.2% per year seems to be driven more by the 2 additional years of performance, and in particular, how some of the older plants in our sample performed during those 2 additional years than it is by the expanded plant sample. For example, here I've added some arrows to guide your eyes to the relative improvement among some of the older plants, particularly those that were aged 6 to 10 years in the original analysis, but are now aged 8 to 12 years in the updated analysis. Again, our data aren't really good enough to enable us to discern why we see this apparent improvement among older plants. But in the report, we do float two hypotheses. The first has to do with the investment tax credit, or ITC, and the possibility that these plants aren't maintained as well as they could be during the 5 to 7 year period in which the tax equity investor is the majority owner. But once the flip in allocations occurs and tax equity potentially drops out of the project altogether, perhaps at that point, there is then a new emphasis on performance that didn't necessarily exist initially, given that the ITC is not performance dependent. The second hypothesis is simply that it may be easier to recognize and then eventually address performance issues that persist for more than a few years. But of course, both of these hypotheses are really just pure speculation at this point. So again, these results are for the entire sample. And although the low temporal resolution of our data prevents us from digging too deeply into the specific causes of performance decline, we did nevertheless use the fixed effects regression model to compare performance among various subsamples of the data. And a few findings stood out as statistically significant. First, we found that newer plants have declined a bit less than older plants. This is perhaps not surprising, given that we would expect, or at least hope, that PV technology and balance of plant components have improved and become more reliable over time. We also found that larger plants have declined less than smaller plants. Again, perhaps not surprising if one believes that larger plants are likely to have a more rigorous operations and maintenance regimen, and that any performance problems are likely to be detected and fixed more rapidly than they might be for a smaller plant. Plants with higher DC to AC ratios have declined less. This is also fairly intuitive, given that a higher DC to AC ratio results in more clipping at the inverter, which can mask any degradation that might be occurring on the DC side of the inverter. Fixed tilt plants and plants using thin film modules, mostly cadmium telluride in this case, have declined less than their counterparts. And turning to site characteristics, plants located at cooler and or less sunny sites have declined less than projects at hotter, sunnier sites. And these results are largely consistent with the literature. Finally, while our top line performance decline number for the entire sample is minus 1.2% per year, if you instead look at just those plants that most closely resemble recent builds or recent vintages, then the numbers look a little better. For example, the subset of newer plants that are larger and that have higher DC to AC ratios have declined by about 0.7% per year, which is considerably better than what we see for the full sample. Okay, to wrap up, this updated analysis was inspired by the rapid growth in the utility scale sector in recent years, which has allowed us to increase our plant sample by about 50% and to analyze 2 additional years of performance with this update as compared to our original work back in 2020. Perhaps somewhat reassuringly, at least from a methodological perspective, we find results that are similar to our original findings, with a slight improvement in the sample-wide degradation rate that seems to be coming from the older plants in our sample in particular. And while the 1.2% per year headline decline rate seems large, keep in mind that we're capturing both recoverable and unrecoverable degradation at the plant level, and so should expect to find a larger magnitude number than a comparable study that focuses solely on unrecoverable degradation, or that focuses on cell or module level performance rather than plant performance. Finally, this update highlights the importance of controlling for curtailment, which is becoming more common and significant as the market penetration of solar increases. So again, thank you for tuning in and for sticking with it until the bitter end. If you have any questions about this work, feel free to reach out to any of the authors listed on this slide. I've also included some web links where you can find the updated report, the original journal article from 2020, and also other publications from our group more broadly. Finally, we appreciate the funding support of the Solar Energy Technologies Office within the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.